No worries.
Okay. Sorry about that. Well, so nice to be here. Thank you so much. I'll give you a little bit of a light background just on kind of what I do on a regular basis. Um, I teach a lot of practical ways for healthy eating, healthy living. Um, and really what that comes down to is helping people like be able to make it eating healthy easy, right? Because I think a lot of times we have this thought process that it is complicated, it's expensive, right? There's a lot of things that kind of go with that. And I teach a lot about the Mediterranean diet, more plant forward, but obviously with some animal protein in there. So that's really kind of what I do every single day. And then on top of that, I teach cooking classes. So I really put that into a practical approach, right? So hands-on. So just to give you a little bit of a more background on my day-to-day stuff. But when we kind of jump into this, some things that I always like to really kind of cover is understanding how to like maximize your time when you're meal planning and prepping, and kind of giving yourself more of a realistic approach to that. And really what that looks like is, and maybe I should ask this question too, is like, think about this. How often do you buy so many fruits and vegetables with the intention of consuming them, right? But at the end of the week, you start throwing away. And sometimes our first thought is they went by bad so fast, when really it's probably more like we didn't consume them in a reasonable amount of time, right? So it's like, okay, well, what is the trick? What is the answer here? And so what I always like to kind of cover is understand, okay, if I'm buying zucchini because I have a plan, I have a date, I have an assignment for it, right? And what that looks like is, okay, I'm buying 2 zucchinis. One zucchini is for Monday, one zucchini is for Thursday. But here's the thing is when I am prepping my zucchini, I'm going to prep all of it. And what this all kind of boils down to is I'm kind of going back and forth with this is I always want to maximize my time when I have the cutting board out, when I've got the oven on, if I'm searing or sauteing anything. So when it looks like prepping vegetables, because I think that's usually the number one thing most people say, well, I hate the prep, or I just wish it was all done for me. Like I don't mind cooking, but it's a lot of work, right? And so I usually ask, well, can you allow 2.5 hours a week for prepping? So that really isn't that much time, right? And then this way you can only worry about, maybe washing the cutting board 2, 3 times a week to some degree, right? So kind of going back to the zucchini. So maybe I'm putting zucchini in my stir fry, and then maybe I'm doing, I don't know, we'll say Parmesan crusted zucchini, right? Maybe I'm having an Italian dish. So especially when we're trying to be more plant forward, right? And we're trying to consume more nutrient dense items, vegetables, whatever, it's always important to make that easy, right? So you should ideally be able to go into your refrigerator, grab a container of zucchini, maybe a container of onions, peppers, whatever's in your dish, right? And so what that is cross-utilizing your ingredients. So we want to take all the things that are really good for us, and we want to do it in a way that it makes it really efficient and really easy. So again, kind of going back to the zucchini, maybe I also have peppers. So maybe I have some peppers in stir fry. Maybe I have some peppers in a burrito bowl. Maybe I have some peppers on a salad, or maybe I'm making a little pita pizza. But when I go to make those other items, they're already cut and ready for me to assemble. So it's always going to be going back to, all right, these are the ingredients that I have for the week, and I have a plan. Because how often have you ever bought something and you're like, ooh, you know what, maybe we make some of that. Oh, that would be good this week. And maybe it would be like, I do this often, so I'm just as guilty, but I've tried to be much better. Um, Cauliflower, it's one of my favorite things. But I will be honest with you, sometimes it just sits in my refrigerator whole and it bugs me, right? But it's like, do something with it. So now I have this thing where I'm like, okay, when I buy cauliflower, I give it an assignment. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna have cauliflower steaks, and I'm gonna do cauliflower parmesan, like florets or whatever. And I cut it one time. I make the mess one time. So to make your life more realistic and easier, you have to have these things in your environment easier to do. And I always think of the things that are the most kind of cumbersome. And I always think it's cauliflower and broccoli, and really because they make kind of a mess, right? So that's just based on vegetables, right? And so if we want to get those vegetables in, and also kind of shop a little bit less on emotion, right? Whereas it's like, oh, that would sound really good, which I know is sometimes hard to do, especially when we love food. But if you can be more realistic of like, okay, yeah, that sounds really good, but I'm actually never going to make that. Or, okay, if I'm going to do that, I have to do X, Y, Z, right? And have more of a plan. The thing that I love to teach, and I actually had a patient yesterday, and this was actually really fun, is I said, okay, make a list. And so we talked about spinach because they had mentioned that they put spinach, they use spinach in their meals. I said, okay, so the grocery list, you have spinach, you have rice, you have pasta, and I think peppers. I said, so next to spinach, I want you to draw 3 lines. And on those 3 lines, I now want you to give me what you're putting the spinach in. Assuming for the 2 of them, 1 bag of spinach would get them about 3 meals, give or take, right? So one was a pasta dish with the spinach in. The other one was a small spinach salad. The other one was like an egg bake with a spinach in it. I was like, okay, that's 3 meals. So when we're looking at that, now I can have kind of a plan. So I can think, okay, I also need eggs. I'm going to make maybe a spinach egg bake, or maybe it's a spinach omelet or whatever. But then that kind of helps the rest of the menu. When you go down to eggs, you have your 3 lines. What am I going to be making, right? So maybe I have a scrambler. Maybe I have the frittata, right? It's going to repeat. So by the end of it, your ingredients should match things you plan to make with it, right? And so again, you don't have to put like Tuesday, Wednesday, right? It's just more of like having yourself a little bit something of a setup, so that we're not like, okay, I actually have too many ingredients. We don't need any more. And ideally, what we're trying to do is being a little bit more sustainable, but also a little bit more practical, right? Like actually using all the ingredients. Like, how many of you could open up your pantry and it's full, but there's absolutely nothing to eat? And it's one of those things where you're like, gosh, why is that? Why is this so full? And I feel like there's no food here, right? So sometimes what I'll encourage patients to do is every Tuesday, whatever, pick a day, right? I pick something from the pantry, because typically what's it going to be? It's like maybe some beans, maybe it's a sauce. In my case, the other day, it was 5 cans of enchilada. I have no idea how I had accumulated so much. But then I was like, okay, I need to consume this, right? Otherwise, a year is going to go by and they're almost expired. So it's being a little bit more realistic and intentional about everything that you buy. So if you're buying beans to buy beans to have them on hand for maybe you decide to make them, that's not a good use of an ingredient or a purchase. So if you're buying beans, therefore, because you usually put them in this, or this, right? So for instance, I always have a can of black beans on hand, because when I work and I teach like 2 different classes and it's a late night, then when I get home, if I don't feel like making anything, that's like my emergency meal. And I always have poblanos on hand. So I'll do a black bean poblano quesadilla. And that's like what I'd call like my emergency meal. It's good for me. It's easy, it's quick, and it's not, no one's Uber eating or doing anything not healthy, right? And so it's really just kind of thinking, all right, I have to set my environment up so I can easily succeed and make choices that are realistic, right? And whatever that is for you, you have to kind of come to terms with that, which I think is always important. Just because I think it's a good idea for myself doesn't mean it's going to work for you. So always remember that, if someone's making suggestions, we always kind of have to meet you where you're at. And I'm always happy to kind of go through that stuff too. So one thing, kind of going full circle again, kind of going backwards now, when we talk about grains. So whole grains are super vital. And we really aren't consuming enough, and especially with fiber. So vegetables we do okay in, we're not great, but whole grains are super important. But here's the thing with whole grains. Think of things like barley, think of steel cut oats, think of wild rice. Quinoa's not so bad, but there are some of these brown rice. Those take 45 to an hour of cooking time. Who's going to do that on a regular basis? And that's not realistic for a lot of us, right? So what I recommend doing is, if I'm making a batch of wild rice, I make a good amount of it, whatever that good amount is for you, right? So if you think okay, I'll actually make 1 cup and that'll give me 6 servings, maybe 3 servings this week. The other 3 servings I'm going to reserve for another week, right? This all depends on time and resources. But if I think about that, then all week I can just add that wild rice into something that I've planned. I'm not just going to have it to maybe have it. And that's how you want to set it up. So typically when I have like quinoa, I put quinoa in like my mashed sweet potatoes. I also put quinoa in my meatballs. I put it in my chili. Like I put quinoa in a lot of things, especially when I'm trying to like reduce my like red meat footprint. I will add quinoa to that because what I'm doing is I'm reducing the amount that I'm consuming, but I'm still getting full because it is a complete protein. So that's what I love about quinoa because it is so versatile and it can take on any flavor. And I always recommend this to someone because some people are like, oh, quinoa doesn't taste like much. Well, if you think about it, if you just took a chicken breast and baked it and ate it, it would be pretty bland. I wouldn't really crave it, right? But it's the salt, the pepper, the onion, the garlic, the mustard, the ketchup, the barbecue sauce, the cheese, right? That makes it. So if it's quinoa or barley, sometimes those need a little bit of love, and adding some seasoning to that, I think, is always beneficial. So when I'm making quinoa, I'm making brown rice, whatever I'm making more of it so it can be ready to go. And this is kind of how I usually describe that. So if my plan is to have rice this week, maybe 1 meal is with stir fry. Maybe 1 meal is like, it could be a black bean burrito bowl. And then 2 nights from then, maybe it's like a rice pilaf and grilled salmon or something of that nature, right? I don't have to make the rice again. It's already ready. But if I want to, I can take this portion and I can add some dried cranberries and some pecans into it. Or I could add some sauteed zucchini and bell peppers, right? Because I have those chopped in the fridge. And that's my rice pilaf, right? Where I'm trying to add more vegetables. So when it comes to like portion control and starches, this is where I kind of am tying this pilaf in. So a lot of times, it's really hard to just have like a half a cup of rice, especially if you're getting takeout and you see how much rice they usually give you in those takeout boxes, right? It is like half the styrofoam container. Okay, so how do I get satisfied with this new portion, right? Where it's half a cup. It's kind of sad looking, right? And so what I always like to do is I always try to bulk up my starches with vegetables. So if it's quinoa, if it's brown rice, or even like an orzo, I chop the vegetables pretty small, right? Because I kind of want to match the grain. You're not going to match like quinoa, that's tiny, right? But if I have penne pasta, I'm going to cut the vegetables larger, right? Because if I have tiny vegetables and big pasta, it's not going to look like it's doing anything, right? And kind of vice versa. If the vegetables are huge and put it in quinoa, it doesn't give it that feeling of more, right? It just gets lost. So a great way to feel like you have more, and especially in the world of portion control, and we eat with our eyes, it's super important for us to even satisfy our own eyes, right? Because, excuse me, it can be delicious, but it doesn't look like enough. So I think the bigger thing here is always to look at it from a perspective of, okay, excuse me, so sorry. If I make this quinoa and I give myself a half a cup and I'm kind of sad about it, versus if I put some caramelized onion, some zucchini, and maybe some raisins and some seasoning, I have a little bit more excitement for eating it. And I think that's where we kind of have to start to emphasize when we're starting to cook a little bit healthier, we have to give it as much love and attention as we do when it's things that are not as good for us, right? And so I always want to say there's always a place for everything, right? There's a place for that really nice, rich lasagna with the whole milk mozzarella. There's a place for that, right? But on a regular day-to-day basis, we want to make sure that we're eating as kind of clean as possible. So kind of going to cover our starches in general, what I always like to say is, okay, pick 3 starches, right? And that could be grains, sweet potatoes, butternut squash, and then cross utilize those throughout the week. And then if you're kind of bored of them or tired of them, then maybe switch 1 or 2 out next week. But typically we kind of stay within the same realm. Having things like whole wheat bread. Well, if you're going to have bread, don't buy bread for one meal. Make sure you cross utilize that. Maybe you're making a vegetable strata egg bake. Maybe you're then making some paninis, right? Like vegetable paninis or whatever. So that you have a plan to consume it within a reasonable amount of time. Or maybe you're just gonna buy a loaf of bread that's like whole grain, high fiber, and then you'll freeze, which you don't think you'll go through, right? And then you're kind of being more realistic with your needs. And so I always try to be really kind of cautious with that. Same thing with tortillas. Like, have you ever bought tortillas and you only consumed what you needed for that meal, right? And then like 3 weeks later, you go back to more tortillas. But here's the thing, why aren't we consuming them on a regular basis if we have them? Like eating them as fresh as possible, right? And sometimes I feel like someone always doesn't zip the bag all the way, or there's some sort of hole, or someone bare opened it, right? And so then we don't have that fresh. Now we have to go buy more. So a lot of what I try to cover is really being more obviously sustainable. Of course, I want to use up everything that we have, because I think we do waste a lot. And so I want to make our grocery bills a little cheaper to some degree, and then just maximize that, which I think can be really easy to do. The other part too, from a fiscal standpoint, is if you are buying more of your vegetables in season, those are usually going to be cheaper. So sometimes that's going to be the easiest thing, which I know is hard because it's like, yes, I love strawberries still in December, even though they're not as sweet. But that is always going to kind of make a change, at least here in Minnesota. I know in California, you guys are a little luckier than us. But from moving on from that, then I always like to touch on proteins. So obviously I want the leanest cut of meat possible. And typically what I'm looking at is, okay, if I'm buying a package of chicken and I'm one person, that's a lot of chicken, right? But if I'm a family of 4, okay, well then that's just enough. But the way you can look at it is one of 2 ways. Is if I'm one person, I can take those 4 chicken breasts and I can make 1 lemon pepper, 1 Cajun, and then maybe 2 of them I call generic. That doesn't mean that they're bland. That just means that they're like generically seasoned, right? So it's maybe onion powder, garlic powder, salt, pepper, right? Kind of a thing. But I can just put that in something. I can put that into a quesadilla. I can put that into a soup. I can put that into a wrap on top of a salad, whatever the plan is. But the idea of this is I can take this package of chicken, the lemon pepper, I'm going to sear it in my saute pan. I'll finish it in the oven. And then the other ones, I'm going to season them. I'm going to sear them, let them cool, put them in the fridge. Tomorrow, for the next meal, I then turn the air fryer or the oven on and I finish that cooking process. Because here's kind of the thing is if I have you cook it all, by like day 4, you're going to feel like you have really dry chicken. And I never want that to happen. Because what do we do with dry chicken? We overcompensate with sauce, typically. At least in the Midwest, they do. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to like kind of minimize all those processed things. We're trying to make sure we're still having food in the best way possible. So what I can do is literally just sear what I call sear the love into it, right? Let it cool, wrap it up, put it in the refrigerator. So when you get home to the next meal, you just pop it in the oven, set a timer, and cook it to its final internal temperature. And the best way I can help you kind of really like wrap your head around that, because for a lot of people, this is kind of life-changing and mind-blowing. But if you're going to a huge convention or a huge wedding, you don't have someone searing chicken right before it gets to your plate. They did that a day before or 2 days prior, right? And then they fire it in the oven all together, and then they serve it, right? And so we're obviously scaling that down, right, to our home to make our lives a little bit easier. And maybe for you, it's like, that seems like a lot of options. So maybe I'm just going to kind of do like a pulled chicken, and maybe you'll do it like, I don't know, like a tinga or a chipotle. And you're good with putting that in your wrap, on a sandwich, in your salad. That's fine. That makes it easier, right? And we can kind of control that. So that's one way of looking at it. When it comes to kind of like seasoning some things, and you're trying to maybe like reduce sodium, always use more of like acids, right? So your lime juice, your lemon juice, orange juice, like fresh squeeze is always good. And mainly because you're getting more of that natural acid and there's no like added sugars to it, right? And so you're really getting it for its raw value. And so whether it's adding like a sherry vinegar or red wine vinegar or any of those can kind of help give you more of that salt flavor that you're looking for. Does it completely replace it? No. But it does help kind of make your food a little bit brighter. So if anything ever tastes flat, adding a little bit of an acid will go a really long way. So when we're trying to make our food a little bit brighter, lighter, sometimes a little bit of lime juice, lemon juice. And I always recommend, if you can, always have like a lime, lemon, or orange, or grapefruit, honestly, on hand at home. And then you can just kind of squeeze that on, right? On fish is really good, right? It really brightens it up. And it's easy, and they kind of last a while in the refrigerator. Now, I'm not saying to buy so much you have no plan to use them, right? It's just more of something where it's a really good addition to your proteins, right? Whenever you're looking at things like chicken or like a salmon or shrimp, because they're already super lean and tender, they don't take or need a lot of time to sit in a marinade because they're already the most tender cut and piece. And especially things like seafood, it's like if you overnight that in like lime juice, it'll turn to mush. So you want to make sure and understand the whole purpose of the acid part. And you can, the best way I always kind of describe this, if you're familiar with ceviche is, right? Like it's literally acid that cooks the seafood. It never hits heat. So you can kind of see what that means and what that does. So when you're kind of tying this all in together, when you're making that list, and we're kind of going back to like the spinach and the zucchini, right, and the eggs. So even when we do our chicken breasts, right, if I've got chicken, what are the other 3 meals that are going with this? And then it starts to make your meal plan much easier versus trying to take a blank piece of paper out and be like, what should we have? Or I have chicken, what should we do with it? I think that gets really tricky because if you were to say, hey, we have chicken, what do you want to make with it? I'm like, oh gosh, I mean, well, we could go any direction. So instead of doing that, what I always kind of recommend, and you guys all know yourselves better than anybody else, but if someone says, I've got barbecue sauce, I have taco sauce, I immediately have an idea of what I can do with the chicken, right? And it doesn't have to be so basic, right? It can be a little bit more fun than that. But sometimes I tell people to pick a sauce, right? Whatever that is. Is it lemon caper? Is it barbecue? Is it taco? Is it enchilada? Is it balsamic, right? Is it a glaze? Is it Caesar? Because then I can start building a menu on that. The other thought that I like to give too is if that's like maybe too much or cumbersome, pick a theme. So maybe every Tuesday, whatever is Mexican, right? And I say that versus so everyone doesn't think they're having tacos every single Tuesday, because that could be enchilada, that could be burrito bowl, right? That could be tortas, tostadas, right? That could be anything. So I always want to make sure that it covers a lot of area. And maybe Friday is Italian, and then Wednesday maybe the theme there is just big salads. So maybe it's Caesar salad one Wednesday, the next one it's going to be a Southwest salad, then it's going to be, I don't know, Mediterranean, maybe olive oil, artichoke, spinach, sun-dried tomatoes, what have you, some feta cheese. But again, when you're trying to make your life a little bit more simplified to eat healthy, I want it to be really easy. So setting that environment is going to be so much easier. So when you're putting in the grocery cart a box of pasta, a bag of quinoa, and rice, that hypothetically, obviously depending on your household, that probably should feed you for a week and a half, right? Give or take, right? Again. And so I should only have to go back to the grocery store again for that type of item, right? Maybe if it's sweet potatoes, that's a different story, right? Because you're going to get those maybe more weekly, whereas shelf stable things. So that's kind of where I'm talking about, really setting your environment up for you to easily succeed. And instead of necessarily buying rotini pasta, spaghetti pasta, fettuccine pasta, it is nice to have those on hand, don't get me wrong, but I think we can be more diligent about, okay, if I have spaghetti, perfect, we're gonna have bolognese one night, we'll have pad thai another night, and we'll do a pesto shrimp dish another night. I don't have to make the pasta again. And pad thai, yeah, it's usually not that type of noodle, but at the end of the day, who cares? It's already done for you, right? And so I think that's kind of what you're really trying to achieve, is really about that that environment. And if you have things that you shouldn't have, and I always talk about this, keeping things within or without your visual acuity, meaning if I'm going into the cabinet to get some quinoa and there's Oreos staring at me, I wasn't thinking about Oreos 2 seconds ago, but now I am, right? And so it's really about keeping those things out of your visual acuity. So like it's only unless you're like craving one and you're like, oh yeah, that's right, I've got those in the back corner, whatever. But I think a lot of times if we stop buying things that no longer serve us, no longer serve how we feel, then we can avoid those, temptations, right? And we can just have better overall health. Yeah, regardless. So I think if you can kind of look at it from that perspective, I think it's really helpful. And sometimes what I'll kind of go over too is I kind of mentioned, we talked about the vegetables, we talked about the whole grains and the proteins. And just kind of going back to a little bit, when I'm searing that chicken, if I have salmon, I can sear the salmon too. I'm going to consume the salmon a little bit closer from the other piece of the chicken, but I have that done and I can just place it in the oven and finish that cooking. Because again, usually having reheated salmon around here, walleye, cod, right, halibut, any of those, they're just not as good, right? And so we want to make sure that you're having the best food possible. When it comes to things like lentils and black beans and cannellini beans and pinto beans and all of those, if it makes sense for you to make your own, right? You can take a whole bag for 99 cents usually, or at least around here. And that can get you maybe 6, 7, 8 meals, but then you would just freeze it. And so then you pull it out of the freezer as you need it. And I always caution people when I kind of give these suggestions from the standpoint of never put things in your freezer just so you don't have to throw them away today, right? Like have a plan. So I've got these black beans, those are going in the freezer. I need to consume these twice a month, whatever. And so you have that ready and available. And the best thing I can kind of really help you like pull this all together. Have you ever cut half an onion and you used it and the other half went right in the refrigerator and you had absolutely no idea when you were going to use the other half? You had no plan, but you didn't have to throw it away today, right? And so sometimes it just stays in there until we don't feel so bad throwing it away because it's bad now. So that's what I'm kind of talking about, is like have a plan for everything that you have in your refrigerator, your pantry, right? Instead of buying things based on, well, maybe I'll decide to make that or have that. And the other side to that is if you want to think about this from this perspective, because I always hear this, I don't want to call it an excuse, but maybe we'll call it an explanation, is like, well, I always forget that I put it in the freezer. I always forget to pull it out. Well, here's my response to that. Have a day that you always pull from the freezer, right? So maybe it's Sunday and everything on Wednesday is been pulled from Sunday. So every Sunday is like your pull day. And then you have it ready for Wednesday. And I'm just basing that on thawing it. So you're not trying to thaw something in the sink or trying to microwave it or do anything, right? And so it's just been a little bit more organized. And I assure you, I am not a perfect refrigerator or kitchen, even though I do this for a living, because my creative mind is always wanting to try new things. But if you can kind of simplify it in a way where it's a little bit easier, I think it's very beneficial. So I know I rattled off a lot there. Are there any questions coming in?
So I'm not seeing any questions. If anyone has any questions at all, please enter them into the webinar chat and we can address them.
Jen, I have a question. I
Yes.
love this food planning. It's brilliant. I'm already picturing ways that it'll cut down on my time and
Mhm.
that little hesitancy to food prep, but this you're making it sound easy. Um, when you mentioned pre-planning carbs, how long
Mhm.
can you keep rice in the fridge? Cooked
So
rice.
usually it's like 7 days. And
Oh,
and it could be longer. It's just most people aren't going to use it, right? They're going to be nervous. But I think if you can get yourself kind of prepped out or cooked out for 5 days, right? And then on the 5th day, you then cook another batch or you're pulling from the freezer.
okay.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Same with like cooked beans, but you said we could freeze cooked beans too.
Hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you can even freeze pasta. You just have to be careful how you put it away so that you don't like throw something on top of it and it breaks. Right? So that's the only caveat with pasta.
Oh, that's helpful.
Yeah. And then to reheat that, um, if you haven't pulled it from the freezer, right, and now it's like, oh shoot, it's already cooked, but it's frozen still. Here's what I usually tell you to do: microwave water. You might have to do it twice because it's still frozen, right? But if you microwave water, because that's really fast, right, and we can get that boiling really quickly, put your rice or your pasta in that, let it sit, drain it out, do it again. Because what that does is it does two things: it rehydrates your grain and it warms it up, versus taking it and putting it directly into the microwave to warm it, where it then gets typically a little dried out. You get some sides that are crispy, right? And so you just have a more fresh flavor profile when you do it that way versus just trying to microwave a pre-cooked grain.
Okay. That's awesome. Thank
Yeah,
you.
of course, of
So I
course.
know one of the questions that has come in is what anti-inflammatory foods should be prioritized in a lupus-friendly meal plan?
So typically, I mean, I know that sometimes with anti-inflammatory diets, it really depends on the person. But I would always recommend doing more like vegetables. So more of like your zucchinis. Sometimes, at least for some of my patients, like cauliflower. When I say patients, please know I just meet with patients about meal planning. I'm not a doctor. But so a lot of times, like sometimes cauliflower broccoli can cause some inflammation for some. From what I've noticed is it just kind of depends on the person. But usually like your higher water content vegetables like mushrooms and zucchini and bell peppers are usually okay. It just depends. Sometimes the higher fiber ones. Um, but I would kind of base this on, if something doesn't make you feel okay, then start to like eliminate that. I'm sure that's obvious. But I would be more cautious to make sure that the vegetables that you don't have any issues with, to make sure that you consume them in a larger scale. And then kind of the same thing with some of the grains. Like some have experienced no issues with sweet potatoes, but have a little bit of issues with regular potatoes for whatever reason.
And thank you. Another question has come in. Can you talk more about reducing simple sugars, ways to do that in general?
Sure. So a big part of that is looking more at, gosh, like your overall plate. So think of where like your simple sugars are, right? And so that's usually going to be more of like your sweets. Like your complex carbs are usually okay, but if you can look at not consuming like obviously sugary beverages, even like lemonades can be kind of tricky, and really kind of looking at cutting anything out that's going to be processed. Usually staying away from some of those processed things is going to be the most ideal thing. Um, Fruit is usually okay. And I typically remind, if you can have it within season, um, like your blueberries, your raspberries, things that are a little bit lower, but also understand that when you have a serving of those, the serving isn't as much as it seems. So like usually like a serving of strawberries is like half cup. That's actually not a significant amount. But for the most part, for simple sugars, it's really about staying away from processed foods. And if you can be more whole food based, which I know can be a little bit, I don't want to say annoying, but I'm going to say annoying, um, because I think we have this thought process that Whole Foods is like this fancy thing, and really it's just having fresh fruits and vegetables in their wholest form. Um, and so kind of really avoiding anything where you're adding any other sugars to it too.
So as a clarifying component of that, is fructose considered a simple syrup? A simple sugar?
Um, like the natural fructose?
Yeah.
Not typically. I mean, usually it's just the way it's. So, okay, when there is a high fiber, so like let's say like raspberries, good amount of fiber, right? A lot of times when you take the fiber, it's almost like, think of it as like not net carbs, but when it's something that's higher fiber, the body actually absorbs it differently because of the fiber, it's going to release slower. So typically, if you're having anything that does have some sugar in it, naturally, like natural fructose, you want to make sure that there's some fiber. So case in point, an apple. Peeling an apple versus having an apple with the skin, because the fiber is in the skin. And so your body is going to process and react differently from a skin on apple versus a peeled apple. So that's really going to be a part of the simple kind of sugars.
Another question that's come in staying sort of in the sugar vein.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit about alcohol and alcohol consumption with lupus?
Yeah, so alcohol just in general is usually pretty inflammatory in general. So really avoiding alcohol at all costs is most ideal. I guess if you were going to consume it, you know, have it with something like a soda water and you have half the amount. And I know that sometimes it's hard because in social situations, um, we want to feel kind of a part of it. But right now they're doing a pretty good job of having some non-alcoholic um, mocktails, I guess you could say. But you just want to make sure that they're not sugary. And I think that's where it kind of gets tricky, but you can usually look at that. Otherwise, making sure that you're having like half the shot, have it with like a soda water. And sometimes I worry about like lemonades. So if you can do like mix it with water and then have like fruit, meaning like a lime, a lemon, an orange wedge to kind of give it a little some like more flavor. Because just the way that alcohol processes in the body, it really just processes it as like a sugar. So even if you're looking at beer that's like lower carb, I still think it's a slippery slope.
Okay. I don't see any further questions. I'm going to give it a second to see if anyone wants to type any questions in.
Sure.
It's been a oh here's a very short one, a three-word question. And can you talk a little bit about protein, how much we should eat, especially considering impact on kidneys?
Sure. So the thing with protein is you want to make sure that you're having lean protein, number one. But the other part to that is it's it's actually as we age too, we should have more protein than you're probably used to, right? So hitting that 80 grams to 100. Now, that is a very vague number because we all have different body types, we're all different ages, sizes, all the things, but you don't want to go anything under. And typically, the way I would shoot for like per meal, because sometimes that's a little bit easier to approach, is have at least like 35 grams of protein per meal. So what that looks like is like a chicken breast, like a 4-ounce chicken breast is usually about 24 to 26 grams of protein. So if you add a little bit of cheese or you have some quinoa, you can typically bulk that up to like 30 some grams based on that. Also understand that when you put like a grain and a like a legume, put them together, they will equal a complete protein because they have the essential amino acids each, right? And when you bind them together, then they're a complete protein. So you can do it without it being animal protein, but it is super vital to make sure because when you think of what protein does is it also gives us that satiety feeling. So we want to make sure that we are feeling full, not like Thanksgiving full, right? But we want to make sure that we're satisfied so we're not craving other items. And that's where high fiber and protein kind of comes into place. But also understand it's important that you need to drink a lot of water with that, especially with as your kidney breaks all of that down, you need more water to help flush that. That's where, if anyone's really familiar with gosh, the Atkins diet, obviously 20 years ago, maybe longer. The big thing with that is when you would have such low carb and high protein and you weren't consuming enough liquid, ideally water, right? You could go into this thing called like gluconeogenesis, right? Which is just really hard on the kidneys essentially, and your body to process it. So understand having good amount of protein. When I say good, obviously we have to kind of like, we can't give you specific numbers because it depends on so many variables. But you can meet with a dietitian to find that out. But you want to make sure that you're hitting those and then hitting them lean. And one thing I like to always talk a little bit about too is fat. So with that, really try to go with majority of the fat that you consume to be unsaturated, right? So your unsaturated fat is going to be more of like your olive oil, avocado oil, nuts, right? Things of that nature. Your saturated fat is going to come from like your cottage cheese, your yogurt, right? Anything more animal derived, right? And so it's not that those are bad, right? We just don't want all of our fat to become from saturated. We do need a mixture of both. But by having lean proteins, then we can reserve saturated fat for things like cottage cheese and yogurt and having some dairy in our diet versus having like a ribeye, right? And also know that the good healthy fats are going to be your oily fish like mackerel, sardines, salmon, some tuna, which I know some of you are like, oh my God, who eats mackerel and sardines and anchovies? But they are really kind of vital because they do offer so much of those omega-3s and amino acids that are really important to the diet. So when it coming full circle back to the protein, it is really important that we make sure that we have a good variation. And sometimes the best way to help you kind of like feel like I'm kind of a visual person, think of this. Do I have a deck of cards on my plate? That's usually about 3 or 4 ounces. That's going to give you a ballpark of at least 24 to 26 grams of protein based on that, right? So does my salmon look like a deck of cards? Does my grouper, right? And usually with seafood, you can have a little bit more. But just kind of overall, if that kind of helps paint a better picture on the protein, hopefully that answered the question.
That was good. Thank you. So I'm
Yeah.
not seeing any more.
Okay.
What I'd like to say is thank you very much for your time today. Your